I was about to put the car in drive and leave the airport when my 5-year-old son's calm voice cut through the silence from the back seat. "Mommy, you have to watch Daddy. He's not going on the plane." I was utterly speechless. My heart stopped. I looked at my husband, David, who was supposed to be walking into the terminal for a business trip, but my son was right. David was walking toward the taxi stand. In that single, terrifying moment, I knew my 5-year-old son was keeping a secret about his father, and I was the only one who didn't know the truth. On a crisp autumn afternoon, Sarah Miller sat not at a desk, but at a large graphics tablet that dominated the corner of her living room. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, the digital pen hovering over a new logo concept for a small bakery. It wasn't working. The colors felt flat, the typography uninspired. Sarah worked from home as a freelance graphic designer, a job she treasured because it allowed her to be present for her 5-year-old son, Liam. Outside the window of their single-family home in a quiet suburb of Illinois, the great oak trees were ablaze in shades of rust and gold, their leaves rustling in the wind, heralding the arrival of a Midwest autumn. Her husband, David, worked as a senior architect at a major firm in Chicago. He had recently been assigned the lead on a massive new skyscraper project, a career-defining opportunity that demanded grueling hours and frequent business trips. Sarah sometimes felt a familiar pang of loneliness in the quiet house. But she understood his drive. She had seen the way his eyes lit up when he talked about the geometry of the structure, the dialogue with the skyline, as he called it. She supported him fully, knowing how much pride he took in his work. On the living room carpet, Liam was meticulously organizing his Lego bricks. He wasn't building anything chaotic, but rather constructing a tall, perfectly symmetrical tower. His face a mask of serious concentration. Sarah would occasionally pause her frustrating design work to check on him. Every time she saw his small, determined profile, she felt a swell of gratitude for the precious, quiet family she had built. However, deep in Sarah's heart, there was a wound that had never fully healed. 10 years ago, she had lost her beloved mother to ovarian cancer. The battle had been agonizingly swift. Less than a year from the shocking diagnosis, the profound helplessness she felt watching her vibrant, energetic mother grow weaker day by day was still deeply etched in her memory. Especially during those last few months, she had mentally collapsed, unable to design, unable to create, unable to do anything but watch. After her mother's death, Sarah had been terrified to form deep connections with anyone for a long time. The suffocating thought that she never wanted to lose someone precious to illness again had become a fortress around her heart. She met David during that long, gray period when she was just trying to emerge from the dark tunnel. Even after learning about the depth of her grief, he never flinched. He never left her, slowly and patiently melting her heart over time. Sometimes, when Sarah would cry, looking at an old photograph of her mother, David would simply sit by her side, his presence a silent, solid anchor. One evening, on the anniversary of her mother's passing, Sarah was crying alone in the kitchen. David had gently embraced her from behind and said, "It's okay. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." He couldn't have known how much those simple words meant to her, how they had become the foundation of her new life. Recently, however, Sarah had been feeling that David seemed more than just tired. He seemed worn down, brittle. At dinner one evening, she had asked him, "Has work been tough lately? You seem exhausted." David thought for a moment, rubbing his temples before answering. "Yeah, a little. The clients are demanding. But I'm okay." His smile was the same as always, but it looked stretched, hollow. Something bothered Sarah, but she couldn't name it. Despite this, David treasured his time with family. When playing with Liam, he fully embraced his role as a father, his laughter filling the house. Liam adored his daddy. Whenever David came home from the office, he would abandon his Legos and run to the door to greet him. One weekend, the three of them went to a nearby park. In the refreshing October air, Liam enjoyed playing on the swings and sliding down the slide. Watching from a bench, Sarah looked at David's profile and felt a sharp pang of worry. His face, usually so animated when he watched his son, showed visible signs of fatigue. He had a persistent, dry cough that he'd been blaming on construction dust at the project site. When Liam ran over, David displayed a bright, sudden smile, but as he got up to push Liam on the swing, he seemed to get winded after only a minute. "Don't push yourself too hard," Sarah said quietly. David squeezed her hand and answered, "I'm okay. Just a long week." The warmth of his hand reassured her, but it also felt thinner than she remembered. At dusk, the three walked home hand in hand. David gave Liam a piggyback ride, and Liam laughed happily, his small hands clutching his father's shoulders. Sarah watched them, their two shadows merging on the sidewalk, and wished this peaceful, ordinary life would continue forever. The autumn sunset stretched their shadows long, casting a gentle, fleeting light over the quiet Illinois suburb. Sarah didn't know yet that this peaceful life was about to be shaken to its core, that a heavy burden no one noticed had been placed on her 5-year-old son's small shoulders, that behind her husband's kind, tired smile, a deep and terrifying secret was hidden. That night, before getting into bed, Sarah paused by the dresser, looking at a silver-framed photograph of her mother, displayed on the bedroom shelf. Her mother's peaceful smile, captured at a family barbecue years before the illness, seemed to be saying something. Sarah sighed softly and gazed at David's sleeping face beside her. He had fallen asleep almost instantly, but it wasn't a peaceful rest. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and as she watched, his breathing hitched. He turned, muffling a deep, hacking cough into his pillow, his body tensing. Sarah gently wiped the cold sweat from his brow with a towel and adjusted the blanket. David let out a small groan but didn't wake up. Sarah turned off the light and stared at the ceiling in the darkness. A small, cold anxiety was sprouting in her heart, but she tried to shake it off. He's probably just tired from work, stressed about the Chicago Tower, telling herself this. Sarah slowly, fitfully, fell asleep. On Monday morning, while drinking coffee, David told Sarah, "I'm going on a business trip next week for 3 days." Sarah turned around from the kitchen counter, where she was preparing Liam's breakfast. "Again? You've been going a lot lately." David put down his cup and looked a bit apologetic, his eyes not quite meeting hers. "It's the big project," he said, his voice quiet. "There's a final presentation with the client. It's the last big push." Sarah felt that familiar, unwelcome twinge of loneliness, but she understood her husband's dedication to his work. David always put family first, but at the same time, he was someone who approached his career with a serious, unwavering passion. "I understand. Take care," Sarah said with a forced smile. There was no particular reason to be suspicious. Business trips weren't unusual in his line of work, and he had always been an honest and sincere husband. However, that week, Sarah began to notice profound changes in her son's behavior. Liam, who was usually bright and energetic, seemed somehow less spirited, his usual imaginative chatter gone. Even when he came home from kindergarten, he talked less excitedly about his day than before. He had stopped working on his tall Lego tower entirely. One afternoon, Sarah sat next to Liam on the living room carpet and spoke to him gently. "Liam, is kindergarten fun?" Liam held a single red building block in his hand, turning it over and over, and remained silent for a while. Then he answered, "Yes," in a small voice, but his expression was dark, his eyes fixed on the front door as if waiting. Sarah stroked her son's head. "Maybe he's just lonely because Daddy's away on business trips so much," she thought. For a 5-year-old child, having his father frequently away from home would naturally be a source of anxiety. Sarah hugged her son, pulling him close. "Daddy will be home soon," she said gently. Liam didn't hug her back. He just leaned against her, his small body tense. That night at dinner, the tension was palpable. Liam stared intently at David. As David was eating, Liam suddenly asked, his voice clear in the quiet room, "Daddy, where are you going?" David paused for a moment, his fork halfway to his mouth, then he smiled at his son. but the smile was brittle. To work, Liam. Daddy's going to work. Liam continued to stare, his gaze unwavering. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something else, looked quickly at Sarah, and then pressed his lips together, falling silent. Sarah watched this strange, heavy exchange, but dismissed it as typical childish moodiness, perhaps resentment about the upcoming trip. The night before his business trip, David was packing his suitcase in the bedroom. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed watching her husband. His hands, usually so steady and precise when sketching blueprints, seemed awkward and clumsy as he folded a shirt. "Have a safe trip," Sarah said. David turned around, his face pale under the bedroom light, and replied, "I'll be back soon." Sarah stood up, approached her husband, and embraced him. His body felt thin, his shoulder blades sharp beneath her hands. He felt slighter, somehow, than he had just months before. David hugged Emily back tightly, his arms locking around her. The embrace lasted longer than usual, as if he was trying to confirm something, or perhaps memorize the feel of her. Sarah looked up at her husband. "What's wrong? You feel tense." David started to say something for a moment, his mouth opening, but he stopped. Then he smiled gently, a smile full of a sadness she couldn't understand. "Nothing. I love you, Sarah." Those words carried a weight that was different from usual, a finality that scared her. Emily felt a small, sharp sense of unease deep in her chest, but didn't know what it meant. "I love you, too," Sarah answered, and hugged her husband once more, burying her face in his chest, trying to ignore the subtle, medicinal smell she hadn't noticed before. The next morning, the sky was a clear, indifferent blue without a single cloud. Sarah, David, and Liam drove to the airport. The car interior heavy with a silence that felt different from their usual comfortable quiet. David, in the passenger seat, stared straight ahead, his jaw tight. Sarah, glancing at his profile, spoke up, her voice sounding unnaturally loud. "Are you okay?" David turned, as if startled from a deep, private thought. "Yeah, I'm just a little tired," he replied, but his voice was thin, lacking its usual resonance. He let out that same dry, hacking cough he'd had for weeks, quickly turning his head to muffle it in his elbow. A heavy silence filled the car again. Sarah glanced at Liam in the rearview mirror. Her son wasn't playing with his tablet or looking out the window. He was sitting perfectly still, his eyes fixed intently on the back of his father's head. That serious, unblinking gaze made Sarah's heart twist with an unnamed unease. As they approached the airport, she could see the tension in David's shoulders, and she thought she heard his breathing becoming somewhat labored, almost wheezy, even over the hum of the engine. Sarah reached over and took her husband's hand. It was cold. "Are you really okay?" she whispered. "You're not pushing yourself too hard? This project." David squeezed her hand back, a reflex. "I'm okay," he repeated, but his hand felt cold and seemed to be trembling slightly. Stopping the car in front of the departure terminal, David took a deep, shuddering breath. Sarah turned off the engine, and the sudden silence was deafening. David put his hand on the car door but didn't open it right away. He just sat there, as if trying to make some kind of monumental decision. It was Liam who broke the spell. From the back seat, his small, clear voice cut through the tension. "Daddy!" David turned around, his eyes wide, and looked at his son. There was something in his gaze that Sarah couldn't read, a mix of fear, apology, and a deep, crushing sadness. But in the end, he just smiled, a shadow of his usual grin. "Be a good boy, Liam," he said softly. David finally got out of the car. He took his suitcase from the trunk and turned toward Sarah. She also got out and stood in front of her husband. "Take care. Call right away if anything happens," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. David nodded, his eyes searching her face, and then he pulled her into an embrace, crushing her against him. It was stronger and lasted longer than the hug the night before. Desperate, as if it were a final farewell. "Have a safe trip," Sarah whispered, her own voice choked. She waved her hand as David pulled his suitcase and began walking toward the automatic doors of the airport entrance. Sarah was about to get back into the car, her mind already shifting to her design deadlines and what to make Liam for lunch. That's when it happened. From the back seat, she heard Liam's small, calm voice. "Mommy." Sarah turned around. Liam was looking at her. Not like a 5-year-old, but with a solemn, adult gravity. "Mommy," he said again, his voice perfectly even. "You should follow Daddy." Sarah froze, her hand on the car door. "What? What do you mean, Liam?" She couldn't understand the meaning of his words. Liam looked out the window and pointed with his small finger at his father's retreating back. "Daddy's going somewhere different." Sarah's heart began to pound wildly, a painful hammering against her ribs. "Liam, what are you saying? What do you know?" But Liam didn't answer. He just kept staring at David, a serious, knowing expression on his small face. Sarah was utterly confused. What was her 5-year-old son talking about? How could he possibly know something about her husband that she didn't? But seeing Liam's unblinking, serious gaze, Sarah intuitively sensed that something significant and terrible was happening. David was still walking, now just feet from the entrance. Acting on pure instinct, Sarah hurried back to the driver's seat, started the car, and moved it to the short-term parking lot. She parked in a spot with a clear view of the terminal entrance and turned off the engine. "Liam, wait here," Sarah said, her voice shaking, but Liam shook his head. "Let's watch together, Mommy." The two of them watched the airport entrance with bated breath. David approached the doors, pulling his suitcase. He stopped right in front of them. Sarah's hands were trembling so badly she had to clasp them in her lap. She prayed in her heart, a frantic, desperate plea. "Please, let this be a misunderstanding. Please let him go inside." But the next moment, the scene Sarah witnessed shattered her world. David stopped, hesitated, and then turned around, his head swiveling as if checking to see if anyone was watching. He looked around, his eyes scanning the drop-off lane. Sarah held her breath, and then, David, her husband, did not enter the airport. He turned, changed direction, and, still pulling his suitcase, began walking briskly toward the airport taxi stand. Sarah watched the scene in stunned disbelief. This must be some kind of mistake. A last-minute change of plans? But her husband's figure was certainly, undeniably, heading toward the taxi stand. "Mommy, follow him," she heard Liam's voice, still calm, still certain. With hands that felt disconnected from her body, Sarah started the engine. David got into a yellow taxi at the front of the line. The taxi started moving, pulling away from the curb. Sarah took a deep, ragged breath and began following that taxi, her heart pounding so wildly she felt it in her throat. Sweat beaded on her palms, making the steering wheel feel slippery. "Where are you going, David? What are you hiding?" The taxi left the airport and began driving not toward the city, toward his office, but back toward the suburbs. Sarah desperately kept her eyes on that yellow car, maintaining a safe distance, her mind racing. Her hands were shaking violently, her throat parchment dry. But she couldn't take her eyes off the taxi. Glancing at Liam in the rearview mirror, she saw her son sitting quietly, his seatbelt fastened, looking straight ahead. On that small face was a calmness, a resolve, that was unnerving in a 5-year-old. "Liam?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "How did you know? How did you know Daddy wouldn't board the plane?" Liam paused, as if considering his words. "Daddy does this every time," he said simply. "He gets in a taxi." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. "Every time? What does that mean?" Liam continued, his eyes fixed on the taxi ahead. "Remember before? When I went to the airport with Daddy, I watched then too. Daddy didn't board the plane." Sarah tried to process her son's words. David had been lying about business trips. He had been going somewhere else all along. Why? For what purpose? Various sickening possibilities raced through her mind. An affair, gambling debt, something criminal. But David wasn't that kind of person. She trusted the husband she had lived with for nearly 10 years. The man who had held her while she grieved for her mother. It didn't make sense. The taxi turned left off the main highway, entering a quiet, tree-lined district. "Liam," Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Did you notice anything else about Daddy?" Liam thought for a moment before answering. "Daddy gets up in the middle of the night," he said. "I heard him. Being sick in the bathroom." Sarah gasped, a memory flashing of David's muffled cough in the pillow. "And," Liam continued, his voice even smaller, "there were lots of medicines in Daddy's room. He hides them in the back of the shelf, behind his books, but I found them." Tears of confusion and fear nearly spilled from Sarah's eyes. How much had her 5-year-old son been carrying? All alone. A child had been living each day while keeping his father's secret. "Liam, that must have been so hard. Why didn't you tell me?" Liam answered, his gaze dropping to his lap. "Daddy said not to tell Mommy. He said it would make you sad." He looked up, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror. "He said you were so sad when Grandma got sick. But I thought it was reaching the limit. Daddy got so thin." Sarah wiped her tears, her grip tightening on the wheel. She had to keep looking ahead. The taxi continued, driving slowly. After about 15 minutes, the taxi began to slow down. Sarah also reduced speed, her stomach clenching. Then, seeing where the taxi stopped, Sarah was speechless. It wasn't an office building. It wasn't a house. It was a large, modern hospital, Crestwood Medical Center. A huge, white building loomed before them. Sarah parked the car some distance away and turned off the engine. Her hands were shaking so much she couldn't grip the steering wheel firmly. A hospital. David had come to a hospital. Lying about a business trip to come to a hospital. In Sarah's mind, all the fragments began to connect with sickening clarity. His tired expression, his thinning body, the persistent cough, the disturbances in the night, the hidden medicine. Everything pointed to one terrifying, familiar possibility. David got out of the taxi. Pulling his suitcase, he was walking toward the hospital's main entrance. Sarah got out of the car, her legs weak. "Liam, can you wait here for a moment?" But Liam shook his head, already unbuckling his seatbelt. "I'll go with you. I'm worried about you being alone, Mommy." Sarah looked at her son, this small, brave boy. On his face floated a strong, unshakable will to support his mother. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's go together." Sarah took Liam's small hand, and the two headed toward the hospital. The automatic doors of Crestwood Medical Center hissed open, and the smell of disinfectant and antiseptic solution hit Sarah instantly. It was a smell she viscerally remembered. A chemical clean scent that bypassed her nose and struck directly at her memory. It was the smell of her mother's hospital room, the smell of quiet corridors and hushed, heavy conversations. Her heart continued to pound wildly as she instinctively tightened her grip on Liam's hand. The spacious lobby was bright and modern, with several patients and visitors milling about, but Sarah felt as if she were walking underwater. She scanned the area, and her eyes immediately found him. David was standing in front of the main reception counter. He wasn't just asking for a room number. He was talking with a receptionist who was looking at a computer monitor, confirming something. The receptionist then handed David a small stack of documents. David took them, his shoulders slumped, and nodded. He turned and began walking, not toward the visitor elevators, but toward a different wing of the hospital, marked Patient Services. Sarah pulled Liam behind a large concrete pillar, her breath catching in her throat. "We have to be quiet now, baby," she whispered, though Liam was already perfectly silent, his small face pale. They watched as David walked toward a bank of elevators at the end of the hall. "Come on," Sarah urged, and the two of them emerged from behind the pillar, blending into the small crowd of people moving through the lobby. They walked as quickly as they could, maintaining their distance. David got into an elevator, the doors sliding shut just as they approached. Sarah rushed to the adjacent elevator, her thumb jabbing the up button frantically. She stared at the floor indicator above the elevator David had taken. First floor, second, third, fourth. It stopped at the fifth floor. Their own elevator doors opened, and Sarah pulled Liam inside, pressing the button for 5. As the elevator ascended, each chime of a passing floor felt like a hammer blow to Sarah's chest. Fifth floor. What's on the fifth floor? Her mind was a whirlwind of desperate justifications. Maybe he's visiting someone? A colleague from work? Maybe the firm is designing a new wing for the hospital? But then Liam's words echoed in her head. I heard him being sick. He hides medicines. Daddy does this every time. The business trip suitcase he was pulling wasn't for a hotel, it was for a hospital stay. The doors opened with a soft ding. The moment Sarah stepped onto the fifth-floor hallway, she saw the large, professionally lettered sign mounted on the wall, and her entire body froze. It read, Crestwood Medical Center, Pulmonary and Thoracic Oncology Center, Oncology, Cancer. The disease that had stolen her mother. The word that Sarah feared most in the world. Pulmonary, thoracic, lungs. The persistent hacking cough he had blamed on construction dust for weeks flashed in her mind with horrifying clarity. No, it's different. Not David. He's healthy. He doesn't even smoke. She desperately tried to deny it, but deep in her heart, she knew the truth. Down the quiet, carpeted hallway, she could see David's back. He sat on a bench in front of an examination room, waiting his turn. The suitcase was placed neatly at his feet. As she watched, frozen, David leaned forward, covered his face with both hands, and his entire body was racked by a deep, silent shudder. He looked like a soldier heading into a battle he had already lost. Sarah approached her husband step by step, each footfall feeling as heavy as lead. She was gripping Liam's hand so tightly her knuckles were white, towing him along in her wake. 5 meters, 4, 3. She stood directly behind David's slumped shoulders. Then, with a voice that felt like shattered glass, she called his name. David. David jumped as if he had been struck, his whole body going rigid. He turned around slowly, and when his eyes met hers, his face was a mask of pure, unadulterated shock, his skin pale and clammy. Sarah? He breathed, his voice hoarse. Liam? Why? How are you here? Tears were already streaming down Sarah's face, hot and blurring her vision. What are you doing here, David? She asked, her voice cracking with the sobs she was trying to hold back. What are you hiding from us? David was speechless. His mouth opened and closed, but no voice came out. His eyes, wide and terrified, darted from her to Liam and back again, filled with a bottomless cocktail of fear, regret, and a deep, crushing sadness. At that precise moment, the examination room door beside them opened. A middle-aged woman in a white coat, her name tag reading Dr. Eris, looked out. David Miller? David tried to stand, but his legs trembled, and he stumbled, catching himself on the armrest. The doctor's professional gaze immediately took in the scene. David, pale and unsteady. Sarah, tear-streaked and shaking. And Liam, clinging to his mother's leg with a fearful intensity. She understood the situation instantly. You're his wife and son, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Please, come in together. Numbly, Sarah entered the small, sterile examination room, still gripping Liam's hand. David followed, sitting weakly in the patient's chair, his head bowed. Doctor, Eris closed the door, granting them a heavy privacy. I understand this is a difficult situation, she said, looking directly at Sarah. You need to talk as a family. On the walls were anatomical diagrams of the human lungs, cross-sections showing bronchi and alveoli. On the desk lay a thick patient file. On the cover, in bold black letters, was the name Miller David. The doctor looked at Sarah with compassionate eyes. Ma'am, didn't you know about David's condition? Sarah could only shake her head, a strangled sob escaping her. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know anything. Dr. Eris sighed deeply and turned her gaze to David. Mr. Miller, It's time to talk. Your family has the right to know the truth. David raised his face. His eyes were red-rimmed and overflowing with tears he no longer tried to hide. Finally, he opened his mouth. Sarah, he choked out. I'm so sorry. He took a ragged breath. 3 months ago I was diagnosed with lung cancer. Sarah's world, which had been tilting, crumbled completely. Lung cancer. The cough. The exhaustion. The business trips. It all made a terrible, sickening sense. It's stage 4, David continued, his voice trembling as he recited the words that had clearly been haunting him. It's already spread to the liver and the lymph nodes. Surgery isn't possible anymore. He couldn't meet her eyes. Life expectancy, they said, 6 months to a year. Sarah collapsed into the visitor's chair by the wall, her legs giving out. Liam rushed to her, burying his face in her lap. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room, broken only by Sarah's muffled sobs. The doctor quietly stood up. I'll give you some time, she said softly. Please. Talk. Slowly. Krena system. And K. 2IR. Krena system. 2IR. She left the examination room, the click of the closing door echoing like a gunshot. Only the 3 of them remained. David took a deep, rattling breath that ended in another dry cough. 3 months ago, he began, his voice hollow. It was that cough. I thought it was just bronchitis from the dust at the project site. But one morning, I coughed up blood. Just a little. I told myself it was nothing. He paused. I went for a detailed examination. They found a tumor in my right lung. By that point, it had already metastasized. Sarah raised her head, her face a mask of anguish and a rising anger. Why? She whispered, her voice shaking. Why didn't you tell me? We're husband and wife, David. We're a family. We should have faced this together. David closed his eyes, a tear rolling down his cheek. I couldn't, he whispered. I couldn't tell you. I didn't want to hurt you. Didn't want to hurt me? Sarah stood up, her legs shaking. David also stood and walked to the small window, turning his back to her. I remember, he began, his voice quiet. When your mother passed away, I watched you then, Sarah. I was there all along. Sarah's breath hitched. From her diagnosis, David continued, you watched her grow weaker every single day, and you broke down along with her. You cried every night. You couldn't swallow food, you couldn't sleep. In her hospital room, all you could do was hold her hand. I saw how much that helplessness, that waiting, tormented you. The memories flooded back, sharp and agonizing, her mother's frail hand in hers, the coldness spreading. David turned around, his eyes pleading with her to understand. After you lost her, you couldn't recover for so long. You said it, didn't you? That you never, ever wanted to lose someone precious to illness again. So, he whispered, his voice breaking, I didn't want to make you go through that suffering again. Not with me. I couldn't bear it. Sarah stared at him, the tears momentarily stopping, replaced by a cold wave of anguish that was sharper than grief. From when I received my diagnosis until I die, David whispered, his voice cracking, I couldn't bear for you to spend every day in fear and anxiety, just waiting. Sarah shook her head, a strangled sob tearing from her throat. But that's not for you to decide, David, she cried, her voice rising. It's not something you decide alone. We are a family. He flinched at her tone, but she stepped closer, her own pain giving her a terrible strength. Don't you understand? The pain isn't just in watching, David. The real pain, the agony, is knowing you were carrying this all by yourself. The fact that you were suffering alone, that's what hurts the most. That's what I can't bear. As if summoned by her words, a small, trembling voice spoke from beside her. I knew. Sarah and David both froze, their personal battle interrupted. They looked down simultaneously. Liam, who had been hiding his face in his mother's coat, looked up, his small face pale but his eyes filled with a heavy, adult knowledge. His lower lip trembled, but he held his mother's gaze. "I knew," he repeated. David rushed to his son, crouching before him, his hands hovering as if afraid to touch. "Liam. What did you know?" Liam continued, tears now welling up and spilling silently down his cheeks. "I heard Daddy," he whispered, throwing up in the bathroom at night. "I was worried and I went to check. And Daddy looked like he was suffering so much. He was holding the sink and shaking." David closed his eyes, his face crumpling as he pulled his son into a desperate hug. "Liam, I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't want you to see. I didn't want to worry you." Liam buried his face in his father's chest, his small hands clutching David's shirt. "But you know, Daddy," his muffled voice said. "I was more worried watching you suffer alone." Sarah's heart felt like it would tear apart at her son's words. She knelt beside them, her hand stroking Liam's hair. "Liam, baby, what else did you know?" Liam looked up, his gaze shifting between his mother and father. "I found Daddy's medicine," he said, his voice quiet, hidden in the back of the shelf, behind his books, lots of medicine in little bottles. "And I also saw Daddy secretly checking hospital appointments on his computer. He said, business trip, but I figured out he was really going to the hospital." David stroked his son's hair, his own tears dripping onto Liam's head. "Liam, you've been carrying all of that alone. Why? Why didn't you tell Mommy?" Liam nodded, his small body tense. "Daddy said to keep it secret from Mommy," he said, his voice almost inaudible. He said Mommy lost her own mother and was so sad, and she'd be sad again. So I stayed quiet. I promised." He pulled back, his face streaked with tears as he looked at his father. "But," he continued, "Daddy kept getting thinner. Piggyback rides got lighter than before. And your smile. It stopped being a real smile. It looked like it hurt. I could tell Daddy was pushing himself." He looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading for her to understand. "I thought if things kept going like this," he whispered, "Daddy would break. So today I had to tell you to follow." Sarah finally let out the sob she had been holding. She pulled her son from David's arms and into her own, burying her face in his hair. "Oh, Liam, my baby, it must have been so hard. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I didn't notice." Liam cried against his mother's chest, his small body finally releasing the tension of his terrible secret. "I was scared that Daddy might disappear," he wept. "But I was more scared that Daddy was suffering all alone." David, his face a mask of love and profound regret, moved closer, wrapping his arms around both his wife and son. The three family members embraced, kneeling on the cold floor of the examination room, a small, broken unit, held together only by the truth. Only the sound of three people crying echoed in the sterile silence of the oncology ward. After a long time, there was a soft knock on the door, and Dr. Eris slowly re-entered the room. "Have you finished talking?" she asked gently. David, still holding Sarah's hand, nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice hoarse. "No more secrets. I'll spend the remaining time with my family." The doctor smiled gently, a professional sadness in her eyes. "That is the best choice," she said. She looked at David. "We've discussed the options. As you know, surgery is no longer possible. Palliative chemotherapy, it might buy a few more weeks, but the side effects would be significant. It would likely reduce the quality of the time you have left." Sarah, wiping her tears, stood up, still holding Liam's hand. "Then, what about the pain? The coughing?" "He's suffering. We can arrange for home hospice care," Dr. Eris said, her tone compassionate but direct. "We'll support you so you can spend your time with your family at home. While we focus on managing the pain and symptoms, we can make him comfortable." Sarah looked at the doctor, her eyes fierce. "Please," she said, her voice trembling, Please do everything possible so my husband doesn't suffer. Dr. Aris nodded and began preparing the necessary paperwork for his release and the hospice referral. A little while later, the three of them left the hospital. They walked back through the fifth-floor corridor, past the nurse's station, and into the same elevator that had brought them up to this terrible new reality. David was still pulling his suitcase, but now, the suitcase felt different. It was no longer a prop for a lie. It was just a bag. He didn't need to pretend about business trips anymore. He didn't need to lie. He was just a man, going home with his family. Getting into the car, the silence was different from the ride there. It wasn't a tense, anxious silence. It was a heavy, mournful, but honest silence. Sarah sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, just breathing. Finally, she turned and held her husband's hand. "How do you want to spend the time from now on?" she asked, her voice soft. David thought for a moment, looking out the window at the bright autumn day that seemed so cruelly normal. "I want to live normally," he said. "Or as normally as we can. I want to treasure each day, with you and Liam, laughing, talking, just being together." From the back seat, Liam, who had been quiet, spoke up. "Then, today, let's eat Daddy's favorite tacos." David turned around and looked at his son. A small, weak, but genuine smile appeared on his face. The first one Sarah had seen in months. It reached his eyes. "Sounds good, Liam," he said, his voice rough. "A family taco party." Sarah started the engine. The tears hadn't dried yet, and she knew they wouldn't. Not for a long time, but a small, fragile light was kindled in her heart. The remaining time was short, terrifyingly short, but they could share that time. As three, as a family, Sarah understood, with a painful, piercing clarity, that that was the most important thing. The car left the hospital, pulling out into the afternoon traffic, and began driving toward home. That evening, they had their taco party. The three of them sat around the kitchen table, the scent of seasoned meat and warm tortillas filling the air, a beacon of forced normalcy in a world that had suddenly tilted off its axis. David, exhausted from the emotional battery of the day, ate little, but he watched Sarah and Liam, his eyes drinking in the sight of them. He laughed when Liam, attempting to overstuff a shell, sent a cascade of lettuce and cheese onto his plate. It was a real laugh, albeit weak and breathless. Sarah watched her husband, her heart a tangled knot of profound love and shattering grief. The truth was terrible, but it was also solid. It was something to stand on. There were no more shadows, no more lies, only the devastating, shared reality of the time they had left. The following days were a blur of logistics. David made the call to his firm. He spoke to his partners, his voice steady as he explained his diagnosis and his immediate, permanent retirement from the skyscraper project. Sarah, listening from the hallway, heard the long, shocked silences from the other end of the line, followed by an outpouring of disbelief and support. When he hung up, he sat in his home office, surrounded by blueprints and architectural models, and cried for the future he wouldn't get to build. A few days later, home hospice care began. A kind, practical nurse named Ben visited twice a week, managing David's medications and speaking to him with a frankness that Sarah found herself grateful for. "Our goal," Ben explained, sitting with them in the living room, "is quality, not quantity. We manage the pain so you can focus on living." Sarah reduced her graphic design work, canceling all her long-term contracts and keeping only 2 small clients she could handle in the late hours of the night. Her new job, her only job, was to be present. The first 2 months were a strange, bittersweet gift. With the pressure of his secret and his demanding job gone, David seemed to relax, almost to rally. They didn't take a big trip. They didn't need to. Their world shrank to the walls of their quiet Illinois home, and it was enough. They took short walks down the street, David's hand resting heavily on Sarah's shoulder. They watched movies in the living room, piled on the sofa with Liam between them. When Liam came home from kindergarten, he would burst through the door and run to his father's room, not with the anxious silence of before, but with the loud, joyful energy of a 5-year-old. He would dump his bag of Lego bricks on David's bed, and the two of them would build for hours. David, his hands already showing a slight tremor, would help Liam find the right pieces, his architect's mind still sharp as he directed the construction of complex towers and bridges. Sarah captured hundreds of these small moments in photographs, her camera clicking softly, trying to freeze the warmth of her husband's smile, the focus in her son's eyes. But as the 3rd month began, the good days became good hours. The lung cancer was aggressive, and the decline, when it came, was rapid. Walking, even to the kitchen, became too difficult. The sofa in the living room was replaced by a hospital bed. The dry, hacking cough returned, this time deeper, and the pain in his chest and back grew stronger. Nurse Ben increased his visits, and the array of medication bottles on the bedside table grew. Still, whenever Sarah and Liam came into the room, David would force a smile, his eyes bright with a fierce determination to be present for them, to not let the pain win. Liam would sit on the edge of the bed and read from his simple kindergarten books, his small voice a steady comfort in the quiet room. One night, long after Liam had fallen asleep, Sarah sat by David's pillow, holding his thin hand. The only light came from the hallway. He had been quiet all evening, his breathing shallow. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. She leaned in. "I have regrets," he said, his eyes filling with tears. "So many, but the biggest is that I didn't tell you. I wasted so much time being alone. I should have told you the truth sooner." Sarah brought his hand to her cheek, her own tears falling onto his skin. "Shh," she whispered. "None of that. We have now. This time. This terrible, beautiful time. It's because Liam knew. He gave us this." David's eyes closed, a single tear tracing a path down his temple. "I was so happy," he whispered, "to spend time with you both. I was truly happy." Sarah held his hand, knowing their time was shrinking, from months to weeks, and soon to days. But they were holding it together,